Welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Welcome to the show, Joe.
All right. Thank you. I'm great. Thanks. How are you doing?
Good. So you're at Dojo Five. You're the founder there.
That's correct.
What is Dojo Five? What is that? What do you do over there?
So Dojo Five.
Like karate and karate?
You're not the first person to ask me that. And that is one of the challenges with the name, although I really do enjoy the name. Dojo Five is all about embedded systems and just excellence in embedded systems, all the way from helping out folks on projects with the technical work to helping out with kind of project scoping and even culture around technical and embedded work. So there's kind of a number of different things that we do. The dojo piece, just to kind of explain the name, because that's always the very next follow-on question. Well, how'd you come up with Dojo 5? And yes, you, as I mentioned, you're not the first person to ask me if we do karate. Mm-hmm. The dojo piece comes from just a love of learning, and I think we'll get into that a little bit, but I wanted to set up a culture of learning where we had some generational learning is kind of how I say it, and not necessarily age-based, but more like you got senior and junior, and they each have something to learn from each other. That humility that comes from the senior guys that say, hey, I've got something to learn from these junior guys. And then the junior guys, of course, learning a lot from the senior guys. So that's kind of where the dojo piece comes. And then the idea, and this has come out in a lot of agile things, you know, there's coding katas that a lot of people do. And there's a lot of like things that we borrowed from martial arts there. And it all had to do with just like a learning environment and a place where we can practice and celebrate the craft. And so that's really what the dojo piece is.
I love it.
The 5 piece is also interesting. I've got 5 people in my family, and my family's a huge part of the business and who I am and what I want to bring to the world. My wife, Kate, I got 3 daughters, Audrey, Mabel, and Shelby, and those guys are a huge piece of who I am and what I do. So 5 are there, and I wanted to bring that family feel to the workplace too, so that we're always kind of we're learning, growing, living together, celebrating successes, you know, like coming together and holding each other up during failures and all of that together. I wanted to bring that together into our dojo. So Dojo 5, there you have it. Yeah,
it's a better name than Schneider and Daughters.
There you go.
See that on the side of a van somewhere.
I had some marketing guys help me.
That's nice. So how did you get into embedded devices? Were you a young child, like building Legos and stuff, and you were like, oh, I just want to put computers into things?
Well, let me tell you about that. Yeah. I mean, my first computer was a hand-me-down 486 from a friend who had a dad who was in technology, and she got upgraded to a Pentium, and so I was like, well, can I have your old computer? And it worked out. I one of the first things I bought with my allowance, I saved up $100 and bought Borland C++, Turbo C++ 1.0. Ooh. Yeah, right. Did I know what I was doing with it? I was like, I don't know, 11, 12. It was that in the scanners, like police scanning at that point. It was actually pretty easy. And I was like, wow, this is kind of cool. I know what all the cops are doing. That's kind of fun to hear, like, downtown Fargo, of all places where all the crazy stuff is happening. I was able to kind of listen to that. And so what I first did with that computer was a lot of programming stuff. And I kind of got into programming, and this is fun. But one of the first projects I remember doing when I was like, I really love electronics, was when I was in the shower, and I loved music, and I wanted to listen to music, but I wanted to be able to change the tracks from inside the shower. And so I ran this old Cat 5 cable that I had, I think from the schools. They were just starting to wire stuff out. And I hooked it up with a tin foil because they had to be waterproof, right? I didn't want to shock myself. I didn't really know what I was doing. Sure. And put together some tin foil on the side of the shower, and I could like touch the right wires to the tin foil and then like switch tracks on my CD player in the other room, right? Wow. And so, I was like, okay, like I love this physical stuff. I like working on that. From that, it snowballed back when Radio Shack was a thing. Oh, yeah. They had all the like 101 experiment type of kits. I love those things. Yeah. Started going through. And so I knew kind of from an early age, I want to get into this embedded stuff. And then college was great. I did an electrical engineering undergrad, and I had a great professor there who kind of solidified the love of the embedded piece.
That's cool.
And then, and then ended up at John Deere after a master's degree. And then they had a world of amazing problems for me to help solve. At the time, they were still working on their automated tractor GPS steering stuff. It wasn't quite out yet, and they needed a lot of help. And I kind of got thrown into the deep end with that, which was great, and I loved it, and just really thrived at that. I worked on everything everything from the GPS stuff to there's some automated section control, they call it. So you can drive these tractors in all kinds of random angles, and it will turn on and off the sprayers and spray fertilizer only in the places where there hasn't been fertilizers already applied. And so in that experience, I was able to kind of see a large embedded system built. I was able to work on application code, as well as then I started getting down to the BSP level. And this is all the bits and bytes and all the drivers for everything from the CAN bus to all kinds of different peripherals. So it was really fun.
How was it at John Deere at that time? Because I mean, they're not really known as a technology company, and I can imagine as these new technologies and stuff start becoming more real for them, I'm sure it's not only from a business perspective a difficult transition, but culturally as well. Did you experience any of that there?
Oh, yeah. They were, and kind of the phrase that I borrowed from some friends has been that they were a hardware company learning how to be a software company,
sure,
right?
Yeah.
And so they could do hardware and mechanical things all day long.
Yeah.
They're super great at it, but software at that point was a challenge. I think the embedded team when I joined was probably about 20, and that was getting pretty big. Like a year before I joined, it was only like 8.
Yeah, I was going to say, it scaled quickly, I'm sure.
And then by the time I left, they had over 200 developers working just on that one piece. And then across the enterprise, it was more like 500 to 600, including globally. So it had scaled to a giant team, and they were learning how to do all that. Mm-hmm. The culture, when I joined there were 4 different repositories holding 4 different pieces of the code. We were using a terrible tool, which I don't know if anyone else uses anymore, but we're all on Git and Mercurial or something good these days. But back then it was Borland Star Team, and Borland doesn't even own it anymore. But the tool just didn't have the foresight to recognize that. Let's version all the files all at once, and so it took 45 minutes to do the build, and you needed to pull from multiple places. It took 10 minutes just to figure out if there are any other changes from any other developer. And you can imagine it's just scaling to 200 developers, like what that means.
Yeah, that's a mess.
So I guess what was interesting about that time is that as they were trying to scale, they were looking for, solutions for us to help. And that's where I kind of came in, and a couple of my friends over there, as a good friend of mine, Brandon Laren, who's still there, heading up their DevOps team. And he and I kind of envisioned, how can this be better? And that's when we started kind of digging into what's Agile mean, And
I was going to imagine that because of the manufacturing process, they were a pretty waterfall heavy sort of a place, right?
Exactly.
Big, long list of requirements and things up front, and get triple sign off and budgeting for, and then build for a year, right?
Very much so. Yeah. And they're, Fagan style reviews, and you got to have everyone spend a bunch of time ahead of time. And it was quite heavy handed. And to be honest, maybe there are some industries where that makes sense, but in their case, it really wasn't all necessary. It was a lot of, because I don't want to say blanket statement those are never good, right? I mean, there are plenty of people that find value in that, but it was not providing as much value.
Yeah, change is hard.
It is. And so let's see. So then we had, I think out of all that, my first kind of, I guess the first time I was able to kind of get things rolling there was when with all the build stuff. So related to all the build stuff, I was able to kind of convince the manager to let me use an old laptop to run an early version. So ThoughtWorks and had an early version of a continuous integration server called Cruise Control. This is a Java app that they had created and shared with the world, luckily. Yeah. And I was like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. Why don't we just build everything all the time? Because I was hearing from over the wall, like, does it build for you? Does it build for me? I don't know. Did you pull all of the files from Star Team? Go do that and have a coffee or something, because it'll take that long. So I set this up on the laptop, and it was just running continuously. I think immediately we could see the value. And so that kind of snowballed into eventually getting some black IT, kind of rogue IT, running inside of our office, where we had some CI servers running. And then eventually I started pulling on and reading about a lot more of the broader Agile kind of cultural things, and realizing that, there's a lot more than just the CI build thing. Yeah,
it's a lot more than just DevOps, right?
Exactly, right. And so I was like, gosh, we could use all this stuff about talking about how can we design the product better? How can we manage the product better? How can we organize our teams and like kind of build towards features? And because we of course had, there was the GPS team, and there was also like the BSP team that only did one thing, and we had our own silos for sure. And we were trying to break ourselves out of that. And so I did luckily find a helpful ear in our management. So there was a manager there, a couple of managers up. We had to get them kind of on board, but eventually they're like, yeah, let's try this Agile thing. Maybe we can try it. I still remember the slide deck where I was explaining to my manager, capital A Agile versus lowercase. Like we don't have to follow all these rules. It's not the value. Luckily, I think the conversation around Agile had already matured at that point, to where like people were starting to realize like, this, you don't have to do Scrum by the book. It's like, it's kind of a thing. Anyway, we ended up doing a fairly big then conversion into Agile. And we had brought in some external coaches, Tim Ottinger and Jim Hood, who are super great guys. They used to work for a company called Industrial Logic. And I think Tim's still there. Jim's off doing some other cool stuff. But they really helped, I think, kind of kick off a lot of the coaching there too. We initially started with kind of the technical folks and just kind of got them going up on some of the like unit testing and kind of structuring architectural the data. And then as we started to even get that moving faster, the management started asking, well, what does this mean for us? Like some of the project managers are like, I don't know if I have a job here in a year or two. Like what do I look like in this world? And so we had a great guy, Chad Holdorf then, who's now like a VP of product at Salesforce. And he was there, and he was really good at talking with the management and kind of got that in. We at the time, and hopefully this isn't too much of a dirty word, they were looking for a model that they could just stamp in. And Dean Leffingwell and his SAFE model was just starting to appear. And so we kind of got on the delivery train deal and started kind of chunking to trains. And it was a great thing at the time. And I think it was the right, it provided a framework to kind of structure that conversation. But we were able to then use that model to then coordinate 600 people.
That was an exciting time to be there.
It was wild, man.
You wouldn't think building tractors is as wild, but I can imagine that sort of transformation, the cultural impact of it, the technical challenges. And I mean, you still have to keep the lights on the whole time while you're doing it, right? So work still needs to move forward, but you need to kind of shift and move, right, as you're going through it. So what about embedded devices now? The type of work you're doing now, you're doing kind of that work, but with clients, right?
Correct, yeah. So we do either services work, which is just, they need an augmentation to the team, or they need us to kind of come in and solve a particular problem for them. Or we do kind of what our newer offering is we notice when we're working with all of the different clients that we have, they're asking us for setting up. I'm kind of back at this, it's coming full circle because I'm back at this CI thing again. There's all these embedded people that are asking for, like, how can we why don't we have reproducible builds, or why is this integration thing so hard for us? We always have this trouble delivering reliably. And so we're pulling together some of the tools that, like web and mobile. I always say I'm so jealous of the web and mobile guys, and I've played in that space a little bit, but there's the tools have really matured in that space, and they've really evolved very quickly. Embedded is like really sadly behind. Like really, really sadly behind. And there's good reasons for that. It's hard to do some of the embedded stuff.
Well, because you got to depend on the speed of the hardware too, right? Because if you're building something, and again, tell me if I'm wrong, Joe, but imagine I'm building this new device of some kind. I've got to iterate not only on the software, but on the hardware. And then those two have to meet up all the time, every iteration I'm doing, right?
Exactly.
So it's like twice as slow, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so, I mean, a lot of tricks get played, like you'll build it for the host machine and run it in the simulation environment, but then there's a class of bugs or a class of like use cases that you have to run on the hardware. So you're building for two different targets. If you're doing, some of the better in class stuff like Brandon and his team does at Deere, they do a lot of hardware in the loop testing. So now you've got like this huge infrastructure to manage and maintain. There's a large DevOps team inside of Deere that kind of helps manage that. And I think a lot of, especially for smaller folks or for companies that maybe they're like mostly mechanical and they are starting to realize they're starting to have these hardware companies that are trying to become software companies, right, coming to them and saying like, how do we make this project successful? And so we're recognizing, I guess, that that formula and that recipe is tricky for a lot of folks. And so we're trying to bring that kind of a great starting point for them to kick off in a, with very slanted towards agile and slanted towards kind of a lean type of model, but helping them kind of be successful ultimately. And that's really what Dojo 5 is all about, just embedded success.
Yeah, makes sense. So if let's say I'm listening to the show and I'm interested in an embedded device, I'm interested in implementing something like that in my business or things like that. Mm-hmm. Like, what's the first thing I should be thinking about before I make the leap and start?
Should you do it? The answer might be no. So there's a lot of things that should never be built. And yeah, I think make sure you got a good value prop. It's less easy to quickly prototype hardware than it is to, crank out a mobile app. And I don't want to trivialize anything, but sure, like there's a few extra things that come along with hardware when you're building it.
Yeah, I think that's where I find sometimes people fall down a bit, is that they don't think about the long term. They don't think 3 years. Where's this device in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, right? Because there's especially in the manufacturing industry, and again, I'm not trying to say a blanket statement either, but there is a culture of done, right? The tractor is done and it's shipped, and
it's model year 2018. Right. Now we're working on 2019.
Yeah, and that one's done.
Forget that. Yeah.
But now with the software and all these things, you've got this constant iteration happening as it gets older, right? And it gets longer in the tooth and stuff, right? I mean, even iPhones, the batteries eventually go crappy over time, and Apple has to release software updates to address the battery thing. So that's where I see people falling down a lot, especially when it comes to the hardware side of things, is they're not thinking of that longer term value, right?
Economies are quite a bit different, right? You've got with a mobile app or a web app, you can be continuously delivering value to your customers in a different way than a lot of embedded devices. I think that's changing a little bit. It's probably cliche, but bringing up Tesla or some of those, like what's amazing about them, I guess, is that they're in a regulated space, and they have built this giant embedded system, which is pretty much what the car is. It's more so, a computer on wheels than it is wheels with a computer.
Right.
and they're able to release a feature like Smart Summon, and then a month later on their earnings call talk about how they already have 1 million data points on how it's being used, and they're going to push out an update to that in 2 weeks. Like Ford and GM, I don't know how they compete with that, right, unless they also match that, right? And so I think for the embedded companies that are able to imagine. So first off, make sure you really want to build this, and make sure it's going to add value to customers, and make sure you've really got a business there. But if you do, now you've got to really strongly consider in this day and age, like, how are we going to monitor how this thing is used? How are we going to deliver continuous value over time? It isn't just a one and done thing in a lot of cases. And the companies that are able to do that, and this is a cycle that I like to call like a develop, deploy, and then monitor cycle, right? Where that's a no-brainer in mobile and web. They've been doing it for years. It's been awesome, and it has revolutionized the industry. Now, where is that for embedded? We're just on the tip of it.
Just on the edge of it.
Yeah.
So embedded makes a lot. I think the obvious applications are healthcare, ag tech, like you said, manufacturing. But there are other areas that you don't typically see, but that's growing in embedded devices. Or is it mainly just staying in kind of those areas? Is that where the innovation's really happening?
I think, everything's getting smarter, right? I think, ag tech, all of the places where IoT 1.0 or whatever you want to call it, right? Like where we just have sensors and we hooked them up to the internet, ag and industrial, that's a huge place where that's been like an obvious, the value prop is just there and quickly. Industrial or manufacturing, you've got these huge $1 million machines, and something simple like, does it have enough oil? Does it need a new blade before we wreck a bunch of product going through the line? That's kind of the obvious applications. But I think then I think there's we're just getting to the cusp of kind of the more smarter things. I was telling you, I think earlier that before we got on the show that I was listening to the backlog and had noticed a couple people that I knew in the area. And I was listening to Justin Graham's episode at one point, and he had said that once we start connecting all these things together, then we're going to start to see more and more like how do these things organize together and how do they provide more value. And I think he's absolutely right there. It's we're still kind of struggling to figure out like how do these sensors shipping their data back make the world better. There are a lot of things happening now in the last couple of years around AI and edge computing where it's not, because a lot of these people got in this thing where, okay, we got tons of sensors and they're pouring data back to the central server, and now what?
Yeah.
Like we got lots of data, now what?
We talk about it on the show. I talk about it on the show a lot, is that I think it happens everywhere in every business. It's not even just in the embedded devices, it's in everything where people are getting and accruing all this data, but they don't have any way to make decisions from it, or that process hasn't really been thought through. Like, what do we do now? Exactly.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, I think what we're realizing too is that like it doesn't really provide that much value to have a crap ton of data just sitting on the server. Like there are some decisions that we can make at the edge, or that we can compute at the edge, and then just push up the valuable data, to the server,
right,
and
not just a ton of noise.
Exactly.
Just because you can collect it, maybe you shouldn't have just collect it all.
Exactly. It costs money, it costs effort, and then bandwidth to do all that, and it's often not necessary. So.
I think that's a smart approach. And so if I'm listening to a show and I don't know much about embedded devices and those types of things, I mean, I know I have my Alexa at home, right? Or my Google Nest or Ecobee or things like that. I hear all these different, like you said, like all these different touch points are happening all over the place where they're trying to track packages real time, and like it's the smart home sort of stuff in the car, the Tesla stuff. But where do you see the future going with embedded devices? Is it getting closer to the consumer, or is it getting further into the business side of things and trying to make businesses more efficient? Where do you see it really growing and expanding?
Well, I think both. Yeah. I think the piece of the formula we've got wrong is making sure that we're delivering value. And that's why I kind of started out with like, there's some metrics that have been playing out over time, over the last 5 years of like how many embedded or IoT projects are successful. And the number is anywhere from like 25 to 50%, and 50 I think is high. So, I mean, and success defined as like, did this actually deliver the product? Is it around in a couple of years? And is it actually like, delivering what it was intended to deliver? I think there's so many initiatives that start from a failed kind of proposition. And so making sure
they're addressing the wrong problem is what you're saying.
Yeah. So from a consumer standpoint, is there like, I don't have my like automated robot to help me out in my house or any of the other kind of like wild ideas. I was a Star Trek Next Generation guy when I was growing up, and I'm like, I want my like replicator. I want my whole like, there was a lot of kind of forward thinking on that, and there's a lot of room to grow, I guess. And I guess I was also listening to David Hussman's, which he was such a great guy.
Fantastic.
Just took me back, but he was talking about this progression from like we're doing projects in the 90s to product all the way here. And I think where we got ahead with IoT, what does 2020 look like? We got another decade, and Dave's not here to tell us what's the next thing for the next decade, right? But I would posit that maybe it's the people and the communities around, like how do these things help connect us together now? We've got products, but like because that's what we're seeing happen in web and mobile, and that's kind of played out a little bit. I still don't think like Facebook was great when it was like gossip for my, what are my high school friends doing or whatever. Right. But now I think a lot of the reason people who end up on sites like Facebook or other places is like, there's a community around something that I want to be a part of, whether it's special needs equipment for your kids or some little widget for people who like video games or, whatever. There's all kinds of different like communities. And so what does that look like when we start building products that people really care about and want and maybe they happen to be connected to the internet, right?
Sure. Right.
To enhance the experience.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a bigger discussion too on the infrastructure side of that thing too. I mean, I recently moved into a new home and it's got smart things in it and stuff. And I looked and And my Wi-Fi says it's connected to 22 devices or something. And I'm like, oh boy, I better have fast internet to have a smart home and stuff. But you're saying, what if I've got smart garbage cans and smart street lights out front and some sort of smart sharing with my neighbors or something, the infrastructure wise, I look at it like sewer lines, right? They got to redo the sewers every 50 years because you can't handle the amount of people that are there, right? So in terms of, is that where you're seeing the opportunity with things like 5G or things like that? Does that come into play with the type of work you're doing?
There's a lot of wireless standards. There are a couple of things kind of converging over the next couple of years, right? Yeah. So 5G's a big one, although what's more important for embedded systems is NB-IoT or Cat-M1. These are like lower bandwidth cellular options that give like blanket connectivity wherever you are. You can have remote sensors or whatever, but now the connectivity piece is largely solved, where that was a big deal back in the day. You were, I don't know, cellular providers didn't really know how to price it, and they priced out a lot of value props. I think business models that just didn't work because we got to send data so many times, and right,
we want to watch our Netflix on our phones.
Yeah, right. So there was this big discrepancy of the same connection that's going to let me watch Netflix on my phone is the same one I need to use to send like telemetry data 2 times a day, and I got to pay the same price per device to make that happen. And now business model doesn't work. We're with those new technologies like NB-IoT or LoRa is another big one. It's this very low bandwidth but long range connection, 10-mile type of thing. Now you're starting to see like these things. Not only is the business model better, the economics are better, but then the power required, because a lot of these, like, who's going to power all these things? They need batteries. Right. How many technicians are you going to need to send out to like replace batteries on your 10,000 different sensors or whatever, right? So I think those are all converging now at this point. We also have seen there's a pretty popular dev kit called the ESP32 or ESP8. There's a couple of these ESP type of dev kits that people have been using that are, it was fairly revolutionary when it came out a couple of years ago, because it got you Wi-Fi for like sub $5 or sub $3, and suddenly people were like, prior to that it was probably $15 to get Wi-Fi on the thing, and people are like, holy cow, like, what does this mean? And so, and we've just continued to see that the pricing on some of these components that help connect all these devices together drive down and down and down. And it's going to continue to happen. And with these additional wireless standards coming out, I think more and more things are going to get connected. Some of them probably shouldn't be, but it's going to happen. And I think, the winners are going to be the ones, like we kind of going back to what we were talking about. The winners are going to be the ones that understand how they're being used, are able to create a community and ecosystem around this set of sensors that they can monitor the usage of, and then reliably, efficiently deploy, and continue to deliver value to their customers.
So this isn't the Joe Rogan podcast, but I do want to get your take on the whole Elon Musk AI is going to come and kill us all sort of take. You work in embedded devices. You probably have seen some scary things like, oh, that thing can talk to that thing. Where do you stand on that whole future dystopian universe?
Yeah, I don't think it's a big deal.
The people will win.
I think the people will win. The robots, we can take them.
We can take them. That's fair.
I have faith in the human, but I've been involved in some medical AI based projects, and it's amazing what it can do, and it is better than humans in a lot of cases. And it would be really sad if we as a society threw that away because we were scared of what the possibilities were.
Terminator.
Yeah, right. Because there is radiology is one place where it's getting used a lot, right? And so there are these very subtle differences in different X-rays that can determine whether a person, maybe has cancer, or whether their COPD is progressing. And having an AI tool help do that and stage that or identify things it's got to be where we go. I just saw a news article about this not too long ago, but wouldn't it be great if we could lay in bed and while I'm sleeping, if something could be scanning me and just like, and identifying things like the number of people who are like, well, we didn't find the cancer until it was too late.
Sure.
It's such a terrible thing that we have the tools to do it. It's just they're too expensive and they're not very portable. Can we drive the cost down so that we can find those things earlier? And then can the AI help us by identifying those things really easily? Because then if you have every single person getting an MRI scan every night or whatever it is, like who's gonna view all those images and who's gonna check them out? And we'll make the robots do that.
Well,
for
but
us.
Then that's where things get off the rails, because if you look back at the Ring stuff with the data collection and things like that, is people are concerned about privacy. It's like, yeah, sure, it sounds good. I'm going to have something monitoring me while I'm sleeping, but who has that data and where's it going?
Nobody should. Keep it in my house. That's what I say.
Yeah, just build your own servers.
Well, or with the amount of AI that we can start to do at the edge now, and there are a lot, we're getting these TPUs that Google and other folks are building, like these custom developed silicon that is just there to crank on AI algorithms and run that machine learning AI stuff really efficiently. Being able, that is already coming where there are embedded systems that are able to do that. So it doesn't need to go to a giant server in the cloud, and a lot of that processing can happen locally. And I totally think where Ring and others are immature is having an opt-out, or maybe more of having an opt-in for, I would like to share my data. I think Apple has been fairly forward on this. When I set up a new Mac, it's like it's opted out and I have to opt in to say I want to send anything to them. I think the Ring thing, as it's been in the news the last couple of weeks, has that's how Amazon responded, right? They have I have to opt in to share it. And I think that's just immaturity in the market. And I think that consumers will slowly demand that. And that all just goes back to this, again, the develop and deploy monitor piece. Like the monitor piece needs to have a opt-in on it.
Yeah, because the New York Times just did a piece on this company that has scanned millions of faces or something. And they've just done it with whatever's in the public domain. And so now they're selling it to police officers to be like, oh, if you can get an image off of this thing, you can put it in this thing and we can identify 90% of the time this person and where they're at and who they are and all that stuff, which is just crazy. But that's the thing, the balance. And I don't mean to get into some big moral issue here over AI and what's going on with you,
You
Joe,
asked the question.
But to me, it's always interesting to hear somebody who works in the embedded device field, the IoT field, to get their opinion on how they look at that.
It is going to be a moral issue because the technology is going to be capable of all of that. It already is in large part, and it will continue to mature. And so it's not going to be the technology that holds us back. It's going to have to be ourselves, like us figuring out where are our limits and what are we going to allow and what aren't we going to allow.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Well, Joe, I want to thank you for joining me on the show today. If I want to know more about Dojo 5 and the work that you do there, where should I go?
Dojo5.com. Yep. Or hit me up on LinkedIn, or we've got a Twitter account. We've got, those are the usual places. The usual suspects, as it were. Yep. Well, Joe, thanks again. I learned a lot and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Schmidt List. If you want to learn more about how Foundry accelerates innovation, check out foundrymakes.com. And if you'd like me to speak about establishing a growth mindset at your conference or with your team, drop me a note at kurt@foundrymakes.com. Oh, and the next time you're on the internet, head to iTunes and leave the show a review. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, because sharing is caring. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to the show, and I hope you have a fantastic week.